The photograph was discovered by accident in the late autumn of 1925, in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Cold Spring, Vermont. A pair of surveyors, cataloging old properties for state records, had forced their way through the collapsed doorway of what had once been the Warren residence. Beneath a half-rotten beam, in a trunk blackened by mold and time, they found a leather-bound album. Most of its pages were fused together by moisture, the images inside erased by decay. But at the very center, preserved almost miraculously between two sheets of warped glass, there was a single daguerreotype plate. At first glance, it was unremarkable. A family of 6 sat at a long dining table, their clothing formal and carefully arranged. The father at the center, flanked by his wife and 4 children. The table was set with silver cutlery and a lace tablecloth, the firelight behind them casting delicate reflections on the walls. The composition was meticulous, the kind of portrait that well-to-do rural families might commission to mark a special occasion. But what unsettled the surveyors was not the furniture or the clothing. It was the faces. The faces were wrong. The father's eyes, pale and glassy even in the photograph's silvery tones, seemed unfocused, not directed at the camera, nor at anything human. His mouth was closed, but there was a faint sag to the jaw, a slackness too complete to belong to the living. His posture was so rigid it appeared sculpted. The wife's expression was taut, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as though forcing herself not to tremble. The children, 4 of them, ranging from a teenager to a boy barely taller than the chair, were still, but not in the innocent, posed way of most Victorian portraits. Their stillness looked forced. One girl's eyes were slightly turned away from the camera, unfocused, as if she couldn't bear to look directly at the lens. The youngest boy's hands were clasped, not in politeness, but in something closer to prayer. The surveyors didn't know what to make of it. They handed the plate over to the county clerk, who sent it to Burlington for preservation. There, historians and photography experts examined it more carefully, using magnifying glasses and bright lamps. What they found did not resolve the mystery, it deepened it. The lighting was unnatural. Daguerreotype portraits of the era almost always betrayed their long exposures, blurred hands, faint shifts of heads, the small ghosts of breath. But in this image, no one moved. Not a flicker. Every edge of their figures was as sharp as cut glass. This was almost impossible to achieve with a standard exposure of the early 1850s. Even stranger was the shadow. Under the father's chair, the patriarch's chair, there was a darkness inconsistent with the direction of the firelight. It seemed to pool there like spilled ink, absorbing rather than reflecting light. Technicians attempted to explain it as a flaw in the silvering, or an accident of the developing chemicals. But no consistent explanation emerged. Soon, whispers began to circulate among the archivists. They spoke of the Warren family in hushed tones. Someone remembered hearing that the house had been associated with a winter tragedy decades earlier. Someone else mentioned the old pastor's journals stored at the local church. There was talk of an unburied body, of neighbors who had stopped visiting, of a dinner table no one had cleared. Officially, the plate was catalogued as Warren Family Portrait, circa 1852. Unofficially, it was called the Hollow Portrait. Visitors who viewed the original image at the State Archive in Burlington often reported a strange sensation, a prickle at the back of the neck, a faint awareness of being watched. Some said it felt colder near the photograph than anywhere else in the room. One in turn claimed she saw, for an instant, a faint fog on the inside of the glass as though someone inside the picture had just exhaled. The archivists laughed about it, at first, but none of them ever stayed late in the room where the photograph hung. It was not the sight of death that disturbed them most. It was the stillness of the living. That frozen image was not merely a record of a family meal. It was the only surviving witness to a month-long collapse, a slow and deliberate descent into a darkness polite society refused to name. And somewhere within that silence, behind the glassy stare of the patriarch and the clenched hands of the wife, was the beginning of a story no one in Cold Spring had ever fully told. In 1852, Cold Spring was little more than a name on a post-road map, a scatter of clapboard houses, a church with a peeling white steeple, a general store, a sawmill, and a narrow bridge spanning the frozen river that gave the town its name. In the winters, the wind came off the hills with a dry, cutting sound, scraping along the roofs and rattling the shutters at night like skeletal fingers. The smoke from chimneys hung low and gray over the valley, trapped by the cold air. The Warren family lived at the northern edge of the town, in a two-story farmhouse with warped shutters and a kitchen chimney that leaned slightly to the left. The house was old, built when the town itself was barely a collection of log cabins. Its foundation stones were uneven. In the basement, the air always smelled faintly of damp earth and rusted iron. In summer, it was a cool refuge from the heat. In winter, it felt like something was breathing beneath the floor. The Warrens were not the wealthiest family in Cold Spring, but they were respected. The patriarch, Benjamin Warren, earned his living as a clockmaker and repairer of fine mechanisms. He had learned the craft from his father, Isaac, and like many men of that generation, his skill was less a passion than a law of inheritance. His workbench, set by the single front window, was always littered with tiny brass gears and delicate watch hands that caught the winter light like frost. Benjamin's reputation rested on precision, not only in his craft, but in the way he ruled his home. His children rose and slept at fixed hours. Meals were served exactly when the mantel clock chimed. Laughter was allowed, but only briefly and never at the table. There were rules for everything, for sitting, for speaking, for silence. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, the walls themselves seemed to tighten around the family. His wife, Ellen Warren, had been born in a nearby town and married Benjamin at 16. By 33, her face already bore the fine, tired lines of a woman who had learned to move through the world quietly. She tended the hearth, sewed clothes, and kept the house in a state of immaculate, almost sterile order. Visitors often remarked that the Warren home smelled faintly of starch and pine resin, as though no dust dared to settle there. The 4 children filled the house with what little life it had. Jonathan, 17, tall and sharp-boned, had inherited his father's precision but none of his warmth. He spent his hours in the workshop, filing metal pieces or sketching diagrams of clock movements, his brow furrowed with silent ambition. Anna, 14, was quieter, softer. She loved stories, especially the ones whispered by traveling peddlers, stories of distant cities and warm places where winter never came. Ruth, 10, lived half in the house and half in the woods behind it, where she collected feathers, stones, and bones. And Edward, 6, spent most of his days clutching a stuffed horse sewn from old cloth, watching the adults with the solemn intensity of a child who understands more than he should. And then there was Isaac Warren, Benjamin's father, the original clockmaker. At 79, Isaac's body had grown fragile, but his presence was anything but weak. He occupied the head of the dining table like a king presiding over a small kingdom. He wore a dark wool coat even inside, as if the cold could pierce him through no matter the season. His hair was thin, his skin like yellowed parchment, and his voice rasped like a file on metal. The townspeople treated Isaac with a reverence born less from affection than from fear. He was a man of iron convictions. At church, he scowled if the sermons grew too lenient. At home, his word was final. It was Isaac who insisted that no matter the hardship, the family must remain whole. When Ellen once suggested visiting her sister in Rutland for the summer, Isaac's fury echoed through the house for days. To leave the home, he said, even for a short time, was to weaken the chain. The blood must not scatter, he would repeat. The house stands only if we stand together. Such words might have seemed merely the stubbornness of an aging man, were it not for the way Benjamin echoed them. Father and son spoke with the same cadence, the same solemnity, as though the phrase were less a belief than a commandment. Outside the Warren home, life in Cold Spring followed its predictable rhythms. The sawmill churned by day, and the church bell marked every Sunday morning. Snow was shoveled, wood was chopped, and neighbors exchanged small talk about harvests and births and deaths. It was a simple town, not unkind, but also not curious. People minded their own affairs. And in this quiet, uncurious place, it was easy for things to go unseen. That winter of 1852, a brutal cold descended earlier than expected. By late December, the river froze over completely, The bridge creaked like an old bone, and frost painted the windows in opaque white patterns that blurred the outside world. The Warren family retreated deeper indoors, drawing their world tighter, until the outside might as well have ceased to exist. Isaac had grown quieter in recent weeks. He spent long hours at the table, staring into the fire with eyes that reflected nothing. Benjamin told the children it was simply old age, the way a clock slows before it stops. But in that house where everything ran on time, something had begun to fall out of rhythm. It was not a loud thing, not a shattering or a scream, just a subtle, almost imperceptible slip, like a second hand stalling between ticks. And it was this silence, unnoticed by anyone beyond those four walls, that would become the first tremor of what was to come. The snow began falling in earnest on the afternoon of January 4, 1852. It came softly at first, a dusting across the bare fields and the black ribs of the trees, and then it thickened into a white curtain that swallowed the horizon. By dusk, the road into town had disappeared beneath a smooth, unbroken sheet. The wind pressed against the shutters with long, steady moans, like a great beast prowling around the house but never entering. Inside the Warren farmhouse, the fire was burning hot. The iron stove in the kitchen glowed faintly red, radiating that heavy, dry heat that makes a room feel smaller than it is. The family gathered in the dining room as they did every night, drawn together not by choice but by Benjamin Warren's clockwork routine. It was 6 p.m. sharp when the long case clock against the wall struck its chime, 6 clear, measured notes. And like always, everyone took their places. At the head of the table sat Isaac Warren, wrapped in his thick wool coat. The old man seemed particularly frail that evening. He had barely touched his food the night before, and now he moved slower than ever, lowering himself into the carved wooden chair with a faint grunt. But once seated, he regained that familiar posture, upright, hands on the armrests, chin lifted. He was old, yes, but still the center of the room. Benjamin sat opposite the fire, his fork moving with surgical precision, cutting meat into equal portions. Ellen served quietly, her head bent low. Jonathan kept his eyes on his plate. Anna tried to hum softly under her breath, but one sharp look from her father stopped her. Ruth stared into the fire, the orange glow flickering in her eyes like candlelight caught in glass. Edward clutched his cloth horse in one hand and his spoon in the other, his legs too short to reach the floor. Isaac did not speak. He had spoken little for days now. But his silence had weight, the way an unstruck bell still shapes the air around it. Outside, the storm worsened. The wind clawed at the roof, the old timbers creaked. Ellen rose to latch the shutters more tightly, but Benjamin stopped her with a small gesture. The rules of the table were not to be interrupted for weather. Even a storm could not disrupt the ritual. When dinner was nearly finished, something subtle changed in the room. It was not loud, not sudden, just a soft unraveling, like a thread coming loose. Isaac's breath, already shallow, grew quieter still. His fork slipped from his hand and struck the tablecloth with a sound too sharp in the stillness. The children froze. Ellen reached toward him instinctively, but Benjamin's hand landed on her wrist. "Let him be," he whispered. But Isaac wasn't merely tired. His shoulders had slumped at an angle not quite natural. His lips parted slightly. And when Ellen looked closely, she saw the faintest shimmer of frost collecting in his beard from the cold draft. His chest, usually rising and falling with slow, labored breaths, was still. The clock on the wall struck 6:30. In that ringing silence, Benjamin moved at last. He rose from his chair, crossed the short distance to his father, and placed 2 fingers on the old man's neck. He waited. The seconds stretched. When he removed his hand, the expression on his face did not change. Ellen's voice broke first. "Ben," she whispered. He shook his head. For a moment, it seemed the world might resume its ordinary course, the way it should. Someone would run into the storm to fetch the pastor. The children would be sent to their rooms. Ellen would cry over the body, and the men would prepare it for burial. That was how death was supposed to enter a house, acknowledged, named, and eventually carried away. But Benjamin Warren had other ideas. "No one leaves tonight," he said quietly. Not a raised voice. Not a shout. Just the flat certainty of a man giving a command. Ellen's mouth fell open, but no words came. He straightened Isaac's head in the chair, folded his hands neatly in his lap, and pulled the wool coat tighter around him as if tucking him in. "He does not leave this table," Benjamin said louder now, so the children would hear. "Not until we are ready." Jonathan let out a shuddering breath. Ruth started to cry, a small, stifled sound that seemed out of place in the cold room. Anna grabbed her hand under the table. Edward whispered something into the ear of his toy horse, as if seeking counsel from the only thing in the room not bound by his father's rules. Ellen rose again, unsteady on her feet. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling, "we have to send word. The pastor." Benjamin turned to her then. Not angrily, but with a kind of cold clarity that frightened her more than any outburst could have. "This house has always stood because we keep it together," he said. "The chain does not break. Not now. Not ever." Outside, the storm beat against the walls like a furious hand. Inside, the air grew strangely still. The fire popped once, a sharp sound, then settled into a low hiss. Isaac Warren remained seated at the head of the table, his eyes open but seeing nothing, his face frozen in an expression that looked almost, but not quite, stern. The children were sent to bed without a word of prayer. Ellen sat up that night by the fire, listening to the wind and to the stillness behind her. She could not bring herself to look at the chair. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it passed, the body had not moved, and the Warren house had begun to change, not from the outside, but from within. Something invisible had taken root in that moment. A single decision that, like a cracked gear in a clock, would only become more destructive with each passing hour. The snowstorm loosened its grip on Cold Spring after 3 days, leaving the town wrapped in a strange and muffled quiet. Icicles hung like blades from the eaves of the Warren farmhouse, and the fields lay smooth and untouched except for the faint, dark line where the smoke from the chimneys stretched across the white. From the outside, the house appeared serene, another rural home surviving another brutal Vermont winter. Inside, however, time had stopped. Isaac Warren still sat at the head of the dining table, just as he had on the night of his death. His wool coat was buttoned tight up to his throat. His hands, once steady even in age, were folded in his lap with a precision that only the living could never sustain. His eyes remained open. They were pale and cloudy, catching the firelight in a way that gave them a faint, wet gleam. Benjamin had positioned him there carefully after the storm passed, straightening his posture each morning as though tending to a figure of authority rather than a corpse. When the body slumped, he propped it upright with a folded pillow behind the back of the chair. When the head tilted, he adjusted it until the chin rose again. Every gesture was precise, practiced, almost reverent. Ellen could no longer look at him directly. She had tried to protest on the second day, whispering through clenched teeth in the kitchen while the children slept. "Ben," she said, gripping the edge of the table as if it might steady her, "he needs to be buried. People will start asking questions." Benjamin didn't shout. He simply said, "It isn't time," with the same calm authority he used when telling the children to wash before supper. It wasn't cruelty in his tone. It was conviction, and that was worse. By the 4th day, Ellen stopped asking. The children responded in their own fractured ways. Jonathan, the eldest, began copying his father's mannerisms without realizing it, adjusting the chair, checking the position of Isaac's folded hands, speaking less. He had always lived in his father's shadow, now he seemed to be stepping into it. Anna stayed silent, always watching the room from the edges. She had started twisting strands of her hair until they broke. Some mornings, Ellen found little tufts on the floor. Ruth refused to sit at the table at all, hiding in the pantry or the cold hallway during meals. Benjamin dragged her back on the 5th night, seating her beside her dead grandfather as if punishment might restore obedience. And Edward, sweet, solemn Edward, had started to talk to Isaac. In whispers at first, then in soft, clear sentences. "Grandfather says it's not time to go," he told Anna one morning. She slapped him, but he only smiled faintly, as though he knew something she didn't. As the storm's aftermath melted away, neighbors began to reappear. The postman trudged through the slush. The woman from the general store left a basket of dried goods at the gate. Pastor Whitmore sent a note, folded and sealed in wax, asking why the family had missed Sunday service. Ellen read it by the fire, her hands trembling. Benjamin took it from her and threw it into the stove without a word. Each night, they gathered at the table as they always had. Isaac remained at its head. The plates were set as though for 6. Benjamin insisted that a portion be served to his father, laid carefully in front of him. Ellen obeyed. The food sat untouched until the end of the meal, then was scraped quietly into the fire. The children stopped asking why. The smell began after the first week. At first, it was faint, a sweet, metallic note that clung to the air like damp fabric. Ellen burned vinegar-soaked rags and hung sprigs of pine to mask it, but the scent only grew thicker, more insistent. The house was cold enough to slow the inevitable, but not stop it. The draft from the windows carried the odor through every room. Ellen started having dreams. She dreamed of Isaac rising from the table, not alive but stiff, moving like the hands of one of Benjamin's clocks, jerky, mechanical, relentless. In the dream he always stood behind her chair, breathing over her shoulder, though he had no breath to give. She began to sleep in short, shallow bursts. By the 10th day, the routine had become ritual. No one mentioned death anymore. Isaac's body wasn't treated as a corpse but as a presence, silent, watching, central. His chair had become the anchor of the room. Every conversation orbited it, or was swallowed by its silence. On the 12th day, Ellen saw a thin line of moisture seeping from the corner of Isaac's mouth. She tried to wipe it away with a handkerchief, her hands shaking. Benjamin saw her, placed a hand over hers, and whispered, "Respect him." The quiet finality of his tone made her stomach knot. She withdrew. The neighbors grew uneasy. Ruth's schoolmate told her mother that the Warren house smelled strange. Someone claimed they'd seen Benjamin at night, standing at the window with a candle, staring out into the snow, the shape of a second figure behind him, tall and perfectly still. Whether this was true or just a story passed along for the thrill of it, it didn't matter. In Cold Spring, whispers traveled faster than wind. And yet no one intervened. This was the kind of town where families were left to their own grief, where the church came only when called. The Warren house stood alone at the edge of the woods, its chimney smoking steadily, its windows shuttered tight. Inside, the children stopped talking about their grandfather as someone who had died. They spoke of him only in the present tense, as if he were simply waiting. By then, Ellen no longer knew if her silence was fear or surrender. The Warren family did not bury Isaac Warren. Instead, they began to build their lives around his absence, pretending it was still a presence. And in that fragile, frozen lie, something in the house began to change shape, like a shadow stretching slowly across the floor. The first thaw of late January came suddenly, turning the snow around Cold Spring to heavy gray slush. The roads, silent for weeks, filled once again with the slow creak of wagon wheels. Peddlers and tradesmen reappeared, shaking off the paralysis of the storm. Among them was a man few in town recognized, a traveling daguerreotypist named Robert Field, carrying his livelihood in a polished oak trunk and a brass camera wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Field was a quiet man, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of deliberate patience his profession demanded. He had spent years moving from one small town to another, offering families the miracle of preservation. A frozen moment, a promise that time could be made to stand still. In an age when people died young and graves often went unmarked, a photograph was a kind of resurrection. A luxury for some, an obsession for others. He arrived at the Warren property on January 20, 1852, drawn there by what he later described as an intuition that the house wished to be seen. The phrase would appear in his surviving journal decades later, though whether he wrote it before or after what happened that day has never been verified. Benjamin Warren greeted him at the door. His appearance was neat but strained, his coat buttoned to the neck, his collar starched almost to stiffness. Behind him, the house exhaled a faint odor that Field noticed immediately but could not name. He assumed it was the sourness of damp wood, the lingering breath of a long winter. "Mr. Warren?" Field asked, setting down his case. "Yes," Benjamin said. You're the man who makes likenesses. Daguerreotypes, Field corrected with automatic pride. Yes, sir. A process of silver and mercury vapor. It catches light more truly than a painter ever could. Benjamin's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Then you'll do, he said. We'd like a family portrait. Field followed him inside. The light in the Warren dining room was peculiar, muted, yet sharp around the edges, as if the air itself had been cut into planes of shadow and reflection. He saw the family already seated, arranged around the long table as though expecting him. The wife sat straight-backed beside the youngest boy, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The older children were unnaturally still, their faces pale but composed. And at the head of the table sat the patriarch. Field hesitated. Something in the man's posture was wrong, too rigid, the head tilted slightly backward, the eyes reflecting light without focus. There was also the smell, faintly sweet and chemical. He had encountered the scent before, once, when he had been hired to photograph the deceased, a practice that some families, in their grief, requested. He had vowed never to do it again. Your father, sir? Field asked carefully. Benjamin nodded. The head of our house, he said. We wish him recorded as he is now. As he has always been. There was a finality in those words that made Field's throat dry. But he had learned not to question his patrons. In small towns, money was scarce, and rumor was plentiful. He set up his equipment with the brisk professionalism of habit, tripod first, then the camera box, then the sensitized plate that gleamed like a mirror in the lamplight. He directed them gently, telling them to hold their poses, to keep their eyes fixed upon the lens. 6 figures in all. None moved, not even to breathe. As he adjusted the aperture, Field's hand trembled slightly. The silence in the room pressed against him like a physical weight. He realized that he could hear nothing, no ticking clock, no crackle from the hearth, not even the soft shuffle of feet beneath the table. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath. He uncovered the lens. For 6 minutes, the Warren family remained perfectly still. 6 minutes, an eternity in which not one hand twitched, not one eyelid flickered. Even the flames in the hearth seemed frozen, their motion arrested in some strange obedience to the moment. When the exposure ended, Field replaced the cover and exhaled. His chest ached as though he'd been holding his own breath the entire time. Ellen Warren stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Is it done? She asked, her voice brittle, like something that had gone too long unused. Yes, Field said softly. It's done. Benjamin led him to the parlor to prepare the plate, insisting on watching the process. Field heated the mercury, letting the vapor reveal the image on the polished surface. Slowly, the family materialized, ghost-like figures emerging from the fog. The details sharpened, the lace on the tablecloth, the silver cutlery, the faint reflection of the firelight on the wall. And then the faces. When the image of Isaac Warren appeared, Field felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. The old man's eyes were wide open, catching the light in a way that made them seem almost luminous. His lips were slightly parted as though he were about to speak. The others sat around him in solemn symmetry, each expression a mirror of restraint. Only the youngest boy, Edward, seemed different. His eyes were turned not toward the camera, but toward his grandfather, his mouth forming the faintest hint of a smile. Field stared at the image far longer than he meant to. Remarkable, he muttered finally. You all held perfectly still. Most families cannot manage such discipline. Benjamin placed a hand on his shoulder. We are a family that knows how to remain together, he said. Field left the house before nightfall, his boots crunching on the half-frozen ground. He looked back once and saw the glow of a single window, yellow against the darkening sky. The shape of the family could still be seen within, unmoving, framed in the light as if the photograph had already come to life inside the walls. In his journal that evening, he wrote, I took a likeness today in Cold Spring. A family of 6. Father, the grandfather. I believe he may already have been departed, though none behaved as such. I felt watched. I pray I never return to that house. He never did. But his plate did not vanish with him. It remained, perfect, precise, unyielding. And in its silvery surface, the Warrens sat forever as they had on that day, together, unblinking, preserved in the stillness of death disguised as devotion. The thaw was brief. By early February the cold returned, harder than before, turning the ground around the Warren house into stone. Frost climbed the walls like an invading mold. A layer of ice crept along the inside edges of the window panes, delicate as lace but biting cold to the touch. Inside, the house began to change. It started with the wallpaper. Once a pale cream patterned with faint ivy, it began to peel away in slow curls, revealing beneath it an older paper, darker, almost black, with a swirling pattern that seemed to move when the lamplight flickered. Benjamin tried to paste it down at first, pressing it flat with his palms, but each morning more of it lifted away, like skin sloughing from something that no longer cared to hide. The air thickened to a sour, almost sweet odor lingered in the halls. Ellen opened windows even in the freezing wind, but it made no difference. The smell clung to everything, especially the parlor. Servants whispered that something in the walls was rotting, perhaps an animal trapped behind the plaster. But no search found the source. At night, the house creaked in new ways. It had always complained with the wind, but now the sounds came from inside, soft knocks from behind the walls, long sighing groans from the rafters, and sometimes, faintly, the sound of what might have been footsteps on the second floor, where no one walked anymore. After the portrait session with Robert Field, the family had grown quieter. They no longer gathered for supper around the table. Food was left untouched, growing stiff and gray before being cleared away. Ellen moved through the rooms with her shawl drawn tight, as if trying to keep the house itself from touching her. The children spoke less, their voices thinner each day, like something was being leached from them by the air. Benjamin, meanwhile, spent more and more time in the study. He kept the daguerreotype, the likeness Field had made, in a wooden frame on his desk. Each evening, he lit the lamp and stared at it for hours, sometimes murmuring under his breath. The photograph had captured what no living visitor would ever have believed: the patriarch's sharp, luminous eyes, wide and aware. There were moments when Benjamin swore the image shifted, that the pupils dilated, that the boy's faint smile widened when he wasn't looking directly at it. One evening Ellen found him in the study with the lamp turned low, his face inches from the glass. "Ben," she whispered, her breath misting in the cold room. "Come to bed." He didn't move. "He's still here." "Who?" Benjamin's hand rose, trembling slightly, to touch the portrait. "Father." She wanted to say that Isaac was gone, had been gone for weeks now, that they had kept the body too long before burying it, that what he thought he saw was just the way light bent against mercury and silver. But the words caught in her throat, because when she looked at the photograph herself, she thought she saw something too. Something behind the old man's eyes. A glimmer that should not have remained. She backed away slowly. "We must let him go," she said. Benjamin finally looked up. "He won't let us." The rot deepened. By mid-February, the house was colder inside than the world beyond its walls. The hearth fire burned and yet no warmth reached the rooms. Candles sputtered without wind. In the nursery, paint flaked from the ceiling in thin, curling ribbons, drifting down onto the children's beds like brittle snow. Edward, the youngest, stopped speaking altogether. He would sit for hours in the rocking chair by the window, staring out into the frozen orchard, his face blank but serene, as if listening to something the others could not hear. His sister Martha said she heard him whisper sometimes, when no one else was near, whispering to grandfather. The servants began leaving one by one. The cook left without notice, taking only her shawl and a loaf of bread. The housemaid, who had worked for the family since before Ellen married Benjamin, lasted 3 more days before announcing that the place is wrong now and walking down the road into the snow. None returned. The Warrens did not try to stop them. In truth, they hardly seemed to notice. One night, a heavy cracking sound echoed through the house. Ellen rushed to the parlor and found a section of the wall split open from floor to ceiling. The plaster crumbled like old bone. Inside, instead of the expected lath and timber, she saw darkness, thick and absolute, as though the wall itself opened onto a void. She staggered back, heart pounding, and the air that flowed from the crack was warm and wet, like breath. She told Benjamin. He came, stood before the wound in the wall, and said only, "It's not to be mended." Ellen whispered, "This is madness." Benjamin smiled faintly. "No, my dear. This is how it has always been." Downstairs, the daguerreotype remained fixed in its frame. A thin film had begun to creep along the edges of the glass, not dust, but something darker, like ink or mold. It spread slowly inward, coiling toward the faces captured there. And though no one else was in the room, a faint creak echoed in the floorboards, steady and patient, as though someone were walking through the parlor, returning to their seat at the head of the table. The storm returned on the night of February 23, 1852. It came not as the gentle snow of early winter, but as a siege, wind howling like a living thing, snow driven sideways against the windows with a force that made the glass tremble in its frame. The orchard behind the Warren house disappeared into a white blur, and the road to town vanished beneath a thickening crust of ice. The house groaned under the weight of the wind. Rafters popped, shutters banged, the chimney howled like some buried animal trying to crawl out. Yet inside, the air felt strangely still, as if the storm had built a wall around the house rather than through it. Ellen Warren sat in the parlor alone, shawl drawn tight, the lamp turned low. Benjamin had retreated to the study hours earlier, and the children were upstairs in their rooms. She tried to pray, but the words felt small and foolish in her mouth. It wasn't God she felt in the house anymore. It was something else. The crack in the parlor wall, the one that had split open like a wound, had widened. What had once been the width of a finger now gaped nearly the span of her palm. She could feel warmth flowing from it, steady and pulsing. If she stood very still, she thought she could hear something on the other side. Not wind. Not water. A sound like breathing. Benjamin emerged shortly after midnight, his footsteps unervingly slow. He had not shaved in days, and a faint shimmer of sweat clung to his forehead despite the cold. In his hands, he carried the daguerreotype. The once bright edges of the plate had darkened to a tarnished black, and what had been a simple photograph now seemed to bear a film, as though something were growing inside the image. "Do you see it too?" he whispered. Ellen stiffened. "See what?" He held the image close to the lamplight. "He's sitting up straighter." She wanted to tell him it was nonsense, the shifting of shadows, the tricks of a weary mind. But she could not. Because when she looked down, she saw it too. Isaac Warren, the patriarch, once stiff and vacant in the photograph, now appeared alert. His head no longer leaned against the high back of the chair. His chin had lifted. His eyes, those luminous, dead eyes, gleamed more sharply than they had the day the picture was taken. Martha's soft voice broke the silence. "He's back," she said from the doorway. Ellen whirled around. Martha stood in her nightdress, hair unbraided, her small hands gripping the doorframe. Behind her, Edward hovered like a shadow. Neither child should have been awake, yet neither looked tired. Their eyes were wide, bright, reflecting the lamplight just as their grandfathers had. Benjamin crouched, reaching out to them. "What do you mean, darling?" "He's in the orchard," Martha whispered. "He's been calling us." Ellen's breath caught. "You didn't." But before she could finish, Edward spoke for the first time in weeks. "He says we don't have to be cold anymore." The wind outside screamed against the house, but inside the air remained thick and warm. Ellen's pulse pounded in her ears as she glanced toward the window. The orchard, usually a tangle of black branches, was now nothing but shifting white. But for an instant she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, rigid, the way Isaac had looked in the photograph. "Ben," she whispered, "tell me you don't see it." He moved toward the window without answering. His breath fogged the glass. "Father!" The storm howled louder, but the sound within the house was not wind. From the crack in the wall came a soft, rhythmic pulse. Ellen realized with a shudder that it matched her husband's breathing. The children stepped forward in unison, as though answering a summons. "Stop!" Ellen cried, but her voice barely rose above a whisper. It felt as though the house itself swallowed her words. Benjamin opened the door to the night. The storm rushed in, a violent, icy gust, Yet the figure in the orchard did not move. It was still, waiting. The family stepped outside. Ellen followed last, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Snow bit at her ankles. The orchard loomed before them, a grove of black limbs swaying under a sky as white as bone. The figure was clearer now. Isaac Warren, dressed in the same dark suit he'd worn for the photograph, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes burned faintly, like coals behind frost. The children walked toward him without hesitation. Benjamin too. Only Ellen faltered. She felt something underfoot, not snow but earth softened from beneath. The ground pulsed once, like something alive. And then came the smell, the same sweet, clinging rot that had haunted the parlor for weeks, now thick and open, filling the air like breath from a long-buried lung. "Come," Benjamin said, his voice unnaturally calm. "He's waiting." Ellen's heart hammered in her chest. The wind screamed, but beneath it she heard a whispering chorus. Not one voice, many. She spun toward the house, and for a split second, she saw movement in the windows. Shadows moving in rooms that were empty. Her body trembled. Her breath caught. She could not move. She could not think. Isaac lifted his hand, and the snow around him stopped falling. The orchard fell silent. Hours later, though it may have been minutes, the wind died down, leaving the house encased in silence. The front door remained ajar, snow piled in soft heaps across the threshold. Inside, the crack in the parlor wall had widened again. Something dark shimmered inside it, like oil underwater. On the desk, the daguerreotype still rested. But where once 6 faces sat, there were now 7. Morning came to Cold Spring, but it brought no light to the Warren house. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried in a brittle white silence. The snowdrifts reached halfway up the windowsills, and the orchard was nothing but a forest of black bones. Yet within the house, the air was warm, thick and still, like breath trapped beneath a blanket. The Warrens did not return from the orchard as they had left. They came back changed. Ellen crossed the threshold first, her shawl crusted with snow. But her movements were slower, measured, as though she were remembering how to walk. Her hair hung damp and heavy, and her cheeks were ashen, drained of their usual pallor. Benjamin followed close behind, his eyes glassy, one hand resting lightly on Edward's shoulder. Martha trailed after, whispering softly to someone who was not there. The door shut on its own. The latch clicked without a hand touching it. Over the following days, the house grew stranger. Ellen barely left the parlor. She sat in the chair nearest the crack in the wall, which now spanned nearly the entire height of the room, and stared into it for hours, unmoving. Sometimes her lips parted slightly, as if she were listening to something. Benjamin no longer slept in the upstairs bedroom. He moved his desk down into the parlor, setting it directly beneath the portrait of his father. The daguerreotype rested there too, upright like an icon. The 7th figure on the plate, the one that hadn't been there before, was now as clear as the rest. Isaac Warren, standing tall behind the seated family, one hand resting on Benjamin's shoulder. No one in the family spoke of the 7th figure. But none of them turned the photograph away. Martha and Edward ceased playing altogether. Instead, they wandered the halls hand in hand, whispering into corners, their voices low and steady. When Ellen asked whom they were speaking to, they smiled in the same thin way and said, "He listens." The house itself began to mirror their change. The wallpaper that had peeled away now hung in long strips, revealing the black pattern beneath. That pattern no longer seemed painted, it pulsed faintly, as if something beneath the plaster were breathing through it. The floors warped. The stairs groaned when no one stepped on them. A sticky black residue began to seep from the baseboards near the parlor, slow and patient. It had no scent at first, then a faint sweetness, like rotting fruit. The servants who had once kept the house warm and lit were gone, but the lamps now burned of their own accord, flickering even when unlit. Ellen tried to stop one of the leaks with a rag. The black substance soaked through it instantly, warm as blood. Her hand throbbed for hours afterward. She didn't try again. On the 3rd night after the storm, Benjamin gathered the family in the parlor without speaking a word. It was not a request. They came, one by one, and stood before the cracked wall and the portrait. The crack had widened into an open seam, revealing not the wooden frame of the house but a darkness without shape. Warm air breathed steadily from it, smelling faintly of iron and damp earth. "It's not a crack," Martha whispered. "It's a door." Benjamin placed a hand on her head. His eyes reflected the lamplight in the same way Isaac's had in the photograph. "Yes," he said softly. "And doors are meant to be opened." Ellen stared at him. The man before her looked like her husband. Same hands, same jaw, same voice. But behind his face there was something else. A stillness too deep for breath. A patience that did not belong to anything living. She opened her mouth to speak, but the house answered first. A low groan rolled through the floorboards, rising from the foundation like a shuddering breath. The lamps flared, burning hot white. The air thickened with warmth, not comforting but cloying, wrapping around them like wet cloth. And from the darkness of the crack, fingers pressed outward, black, thin, and slick, sliding against the torn plaster as though testing the air. Ellen screamed for the first time in weeks. Benjamin didn't flinch. He stepped forward and whispered, "Father." The fingers withdrew, but not in retreat, in invitation. That night, the Warren children did not return to their beds. They slept in the parlor, curled up against the warm boards, their small faces serene. Ellen sat in her chair, staring into the darkness, her hands trembling. Benjamin remained standing before the crack, motionless. The portrait watched them all. Outside, the snow began to melt unnaturally fast, steam rising from the orchard though the temperature was still below freezing. The apple trees, stripped of leaves and life, dripped with condensation, as if something beneath the soil was breathing through them. By the fourth day, the house had grown hollow. Rooms upstairs began to lose their shape. Ellen walked into the nursery and found the walls subtly closer than before, the corners slanting inward. Furniture shifted an inch at a time, never while watched. The mirror in the upstairs hall no longer reflected the family, only the empty room behind them. And in the parlor, the crack had stretched to the ceiling. It was no longer a blemish. It was a throat. Late that night, as the lamps dimmed on their own, Ellen sat alone while the others slept on the floor. She pressed her palm to her chest, trying to feel her heartbeat. It was faint, distant, like it belonged to someone else. The warmth from the wall pulsed against her back in time with something she did not understand. She turned her gaze to the portrait. All 7 figures stared back. And then, very slowly, Isaac Warren's mouth began to smile.